For this pattern, I'm going to use a charm pack, and I'm going to use 60 squares from the charm pack. This is 5-inch squares, and this is from Craft Cotton Company. There are 5 designs in this pack, and it's called Beetanical. I'll put the details down below. And when I do my 9 patch, I'm going to want to cut it to break up that dark black block in the middle, and I've put it against yardage from a crisp white cotton. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut 48 5-inch blocks from yardage, which will give me 108 5-inch squares. For each block, you can see I need 5 pattern pieces, and I need 4 contrast. In this case, it's going to be white. I'm going to need 3 blocks across, which will make 3 times 14-inch blocks, which will give me a 42-inch wide, and 4 blocks down, 12 blocks, will give me a 56-inch length. That's before I add any borders. That's a good manageable size for a throw. At the beginning of any project, I recommend a good light, a flat surface, a very secure cutting tool, and your rotary cutter. If you haven't cleaned it, now's the time to do it, because I'm going to cut through 4 pieces of quite thick cotton here. If it's time to change your blade, you'll notice that it doesn't cut through cleanly. The pattern for my 9 piece is going to stay the same throughout, so I'm going to sew right sides together, one over the other, and then the top over that. I'm going to keep all my pieces together, and I'm going to chain piece at my machine to make it easier for me. I've chosen to sew the topper on this quilt on my vintage hand cranked Singer sewing machine. This is 1939, and the lady that I'm making it for was born in 1943. So this machine was 4 years old when she was born, and I'll be able to put that into the story of the quilt for her in the card. I think she'll be delighted about that. Now, I finished with a quilt, so I've changed from a walking foot back to my presser foot. I've changed from a denim needle. I've discarded that one in the sharps bin, and I've chosen a 9014, which is for a medium weight fabric. It's fine for this cotton. And I've chosen a vintage cotton. This is from the 1970s, most likely. It's Sylko, and it's mercerized, which means strengthened thread. The colour is gold, the weight of it is 36, and the colour code is 103. I call this a gold, and it'll go beautifully with the threads I've got. This machine really likes vintage threads, so do I. Right, so I've threaded my machine and loaded the bobbin, and I've done a test piece. I've used calico for this, and I'm happy with my tension front and back. You can see the difference in the gold there. I would say this was about a 2.25 stitch. I'm not going to alter the stitch length on here, but if you've got a machine that you can alter the stitch length, use between a 2 and a 2.5 for quilting, especially if you're going to cut into those stitches. What is important is I get a good 1/4 inch seam through that, and to help with that, I use the tape and the magnetic 1/4 inch seam line from hemline, and that helps me keep even throughout. Okay, let's go. Finger press the seam so that the excess cotton from the seam is going underneath the patterned fabric rather than showing through the white. That way, when I come to lay one on top of another, the seams are going to nest. You can use pins for this, but I recommend that you get used to feeling what it feels like to have the seams nest beneath your fingers. On this machine, I've only got one hand to do this. This is easier to do on an electric machine. Also note that I sound a bit bunged up. It's because I've got hay fever. My apologies for that. I do take tablets for it, but at this time of the year, I do sound a bit nasal. Nothing to do with these bees, of course. I always like to do one block and check I've done it right before I continue. And I've spotted on this that I've sewn these two pieces on the wrong way round. So I'm going to unpick this seam. I should have joined it at this seam at the top. So I'm going to unpick it and sew it correctly and then leave it in front of me so I can check every other 9 patch against this first one. I'm using a seam ripper here, and I just advise you to go very carefully because you don't want to damage this fabric. I am going to want to sew into that seam again, so don't pull at it too tightly. On the reverse, you'll see that I've ironed and pressed the seams away from the central block, and then I've steam pressed them on the front. Check that your points meet and you're happy with those. So that's my first test block done, another 11 to go. I use this steam iron from Russell Hobbs. Really happy with it. The more you sew, the more you'll get used to your machine. This machine doesn't like to backstitch, so you'll notice that I leave my ends loose. I'll tie those in or cut them off later. It doesn't mind chain piecing. Now, somebody did ask me in the comments about an old vintage Singer sewing machine and said that their machine was running slow. My advice to her was to get the machine professionally cleaned and serviced. It might be that there's a build-up of oil and grease and lint inside the machine. It isn't something that I would recommend doing yourself unless you know exactly what you're doing with it. This machine sews forward like a dream. Trying to get the orientation right on this. The hives look ridiculous on their sides, so this needs to be upright. Likewise, the bees need to be upright. And in doing so, I've kept the central piece, which looks a little bit like silver birch trees to me. I've kept that vertical, and that'll make a difference when I start cutting into this design. Now, when I'm sewing this, it means that sometimes your patterns are upside down, so do make sure you get the orientation right. I had to unpick this once. I've now created a simple 9 patch, and what I want to do is cut it. So I split open and cut into 4 this central black mark. That will make a very distinct pattern throughout, and I want to keep the orientation of both these pieces. So I'm going to make cuts vertically and horizontally across the central piece, and the central piece measures 4.5 inches. Check it with your ruler. And then on my easy rule, I've marked 2.25 inches. And I always recommend that you do this because it's easy to slide to the 2.5 inches. So take it to the 2.25 inch edge, line up that edge, and then cut. Lining it up to cut, make sure that your mark lands on the edge of these pieces too, not just in the centre. For my vertical cut, I move the ruler, not the fabric. If you have a turntable, this is the time to use it. Now looks like this. If I change this and this piece, I'll end up with 2 small diagonal squares centrally and 2 in the corner. And as I piece them together, these will create another diagonal. But as you see, this and this piece, which have to be correctly orientated, are in the right orientation. Right, I'm going to sew them together now as if they were a full patch. Right sides together, that to that, that to that, that to that. And I'm going to do that on all 12 squares. Once you've pressed it, your block will look like this, and it now measures 13.5 inches. Let's go finish all the rest. I'm sewing them together 3 blocks across, and I'll do that 4 times, and then I'll add the first row to the second, to the third, and then to the fourth. So we have 12 blocks of 3 across and 4 down. People ask me how long does it take to make a quilt, and it depends entirely on the design, the type of fabric, the trustworthiness of your machines. One of the quilts I'm now on my 3rd machine to try and complete that quilt. But because this is a gift, I try and allocate a month. So I started a month before I want to give the gift, taking into account I might be posting it. So I give myself a month. I only do the throw size. I don't do anything bigger than that. But a month gives me a little bit of leeway in case I'm not well enough to sew some days or something goes wrong. Well, I now have it laid out on my bed, and I wanted to show you how the pattern design comes together. You can see that the orientation is correct for the beehives and for the bees. It doesn't really matter if these bees are in different directions. This happens to remain all in vertical, but actually your eye is drawn to the contrast of the black, which forms a diagonal across the quilt, and then there is the relief of the white. Now I'm going to show you this in grayscale too. This is just a simple disappearing 9 patch, but this actually lets the fabric and the colours really shine. Now for a border, I'm going to do a 2-inch white border, and then I've got a very bright mustard which will pick out this vibrant colour here. And then I'm going to use a black trim. This now measures 39 by 52 before I add the borders. From the yardage, I'm going to cut 2.5-inch strips for an inner border. When adding borders, I choose to do the sides first and then add the header and the footer. I'm using a 1/4-inch seam. And the other thing you'll notice here is I've left the tail ends from my sewing on this machine. This machine doesn't like to reverse stitch. So where I can knot 2 ends together, I'll knot it, otherwise I'll tie them or sew them in at the back. What I don't want is loose ends showing through white fabric. I'll do that as a sitting down job though. Sitting down in my comfy chair, that is. I'm currently recording Family Fortune, so I'll watch that later. The outer border at 3 inches, which will give me a finished border of 2.5 inches, just to frame and match the yellow in the design. This is the last piece of sewing on the vintage sewing machine. I just need to give it a good press. When I add the backing and the wadding, I'm going to be quilting this on my new machine, which is not yet unboxed, and give the quilt a final press. It now measures 48 by 62. And just adding 2 borders can just highlight the colours and accentuate the bright yellows in this. This is a simple disappearing 9 patch, but if you use really interesting colourful fabrics, your sewing will help accentuate and really showcase them rather than the patchwork design taking over. Right, I've just got to quilt it now. Come back and join me for that, won't you? This is Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter, saying bye for now. Come back and see me soon, won't you? Bye.